and likely welcome back to my channel. As promised, here is the follow-up part 2 video to my ranking the 27 official MCU films up to this point. If you haven't seen that video, I'll pop a little card up at the top there. In the description below, I'll put the timestamps of when I talk about each of the 4 films that I'll be bringing up. And in general, these are just the films that I had more feelings about, that I thought deserved another video, that I couldn't really express everything well in the short amount of time I had in my last video. So we're going to start with Avengers Age of Ultron. There was a lot that I just really didn't like about this movie, even from the first viewing. Wasn't satisfied. So from the very beginning of the film, they do that whole language pun that carries on through the rest of it. And honestly, I just don't think that that makes sense. I know that they did it because Steve is supposedly like, oh, Captain America, good boy, whatever. But he cusses like just as much, if not more, than the rest of the characters in the films. Now, I don't know so much about the comics, but in the movies, Steve's language is not actually good. So for them to be like all up in arms about it, I don't know, it just came off as weird and kind of dumb. My next grievance for it is about the entire Black Widow subplot with Bruce Banner. That didn't make sense to me at all, and it seemed like the only reason they did it was because they gave Hawkeye a family and wanted to like quell any thoughts of, oh, Hawkeye and Natasha being together. But giving Hawkeye a family just kind of made it seem like he wasn't a good dad because he was always skipping out on his kids who needed him, and honestly, does not matter what his job is. He's not there for his kids. That's messed up. I don't know why he's married with children if he's always gone. It also just makes his relationship with Natasha really strange, because it's not bad for people to have platonic relationships, you know, they're friends, but his bond with Natasha is just so much deeper than anything we see with his wife. Like, they don't even have good chemistry, which is the fault of the actors more than anything else, I guess, but it just doesn't work. And he could have had a family, but I think it would have worked out a lot better if Laura was like his sister. You know, they could have done the thing where, similar to the TV show Falcon and Winter Soldier, where it's his sister and her kids. So then that takes away some of the responsibility from him, where it's like, dude, why are you such a bad dad? Why are you always gone? And instead makes it like, oh, he shows up when he can, he helps out, he's a good guy, you know? And then it also takes away any of the weird Natasha sort of side of things. Following these 2 points, I just don't like how Natasha was treated in this film in general. Everything with Bruce was just weird and really forced, and we hadn't seen any real evidence of it before. They took like a couple of scenes out of the first Avengers film and we're like, oh yeah, this is why. And it's like, no, it's not the same feeling. She's scared of him. That's not like, oh, let's start a relationship. And that entire scene where she's like getting out of the shower or whatever at Clint's house, and she's really coming on strong to Bruce, and he just looks wildly uncomfortable the entire time. And she goes into this whole thing about, oh, I can't have children, and I'm such a monster, and all of this stuff. And it's just like, I don't know who cleared that conversation in Marvel, but I don't think that they did their job very well, because it just came across as really awkward and uncomfortable, and that's not what you want for a love story. That is not, no, I'm not a fan at all. People tend to struggle for some reason with making strong women emotionally vulnerable, because a lot of Natasha's scenes where she is being emotionally vulnerable, she just sort of comes across as weak, and it doesn't have to be that way. That's just a sign of poor writing and people that don't really understand all of the nuances of how to do that well. So I was just really disappointed with the way that her character was handled in this entire film. I was also not a fan of Tony Stark's character development, or lack thereof, or even so much so as a regression of character development in this film. The first two Iron Man films and even the first Avengers film, I was like, oh yeah, no, he's cool. And then everything after that just downhill for me. Moving on to Endgame, just like I said in my previous video, it was just really apparent to me that the endings were based on contracts and not necessarily character arcs. So people who they wanted to set up new shows for, they ended them a certain way, and then people whose contracts were expiring that were going to continue with Marvel, it's like they ended them a certain way. You went into the movie knowing how it would end, and yet they somehow still managed to mess it up. I don't know, just not great. So starting with Natasha again, I feel like there's a lot of films on this list where my main issues are with how Natasha's handled. But going into the scene, I didn't have an issue so much so with the scene itself, but what I do have an issue with is one, how it was handled after the scene was over, and two, the fact that she was the one that died, and some of the subtext of that, I guess you could say. Here's what I mean by that. So Clint survives because Clint has a family, essentially. Because when you compare the two characters of Clint and Natasha, based on their MCU representations, not the comics, MCU, Clint is not a very strong character. He hasn't been developed very well, and he's just kind of flat. And Natasha is like fan-freaking-tastic. So if you're choosing which character to kill off in that moment, it seems really weird to choose the one that is beloved and not the one that people are like, wait, what's with him again? So I think they wanted to do the whole Hawkeye show thing, all of that. That's not really an issue, but my problem is that Clint's life is ascribed more value, like inherently, just because he has a wife and kids. So that's a very heteronormative ideal. Now, this is delicate, but when you pair this with all of the stuff that happened in Age of Ultron, where Natasha is actively upset that the ability to have children was taken from her, and it was a really problematic conversation because she's like ascribing value and worth to herself based on whether or not she can have kids and like what she brings to a relationship. So that's a problem. But when you say that Clint deserves to live more because he has a family that we didn't really even need, but a family, and then you're like, and Natasha doesn't, isn't that kind of saying that women who either cannot bear children or choose not to bear children matter less? So I know that that might seem like kind of a stretch, but my point is that the writers are on some really thin ice there, and I'm just not really a fan of any of that situation. Moving on from whether or not she should have died, given that she did die, why was she not given a funeral? Tony Stark had everyone and their freaking third cousin come to his funeral, even people that he actively tried to kill. And what happens with Natasha? Oh, I don't know. She gets like a few angsty dudes standing in a circle being sad. Like, I don't like it when female characters, especially the death of female characters, ends up being just a plot device for the male characters to center some action around. Like, to me, that's not okay. And she was running the Avengers during the snap. She's been around almost as long as Tony Stark has. Remember, Iron Man 2, that's when she was introduced. She's a really strong Avenger. She's not just some random side character. And we, like, in the Hawkeye show, they start to kind of give closure about her death. But why the heck was she not, like, why was there no funeral? Why was she not part of the Tony Stark funeral? Tony Stark is great. Nothing against him having a funeral. He deserved it. Great sacrifice. All that jazz. But where was Natasha's funeral? Like, if they weren't going to bring her back to life, what were they doing? And now we're arriving at one of the things that I liked the first time I saw the movie and really disliked the second time. So Steve's whole ending with Peggy. Now, the first time I watched it, I cried. I was like, that's so beautiful. He's dancing with Peggy. They finally got their dance. And the second time I watched it, I was like, this creates a lot of problems, actually, especially if you've seen the Loki show. There are many questions this raises. For example, what about the sacred timeline? So we have two options here. Either Steve going back into time created an alternate reality. If that's true, then I don't know, more power to him, but where were the TVA? What's with that whole situation? What's going on? Like, how did he end up back in our timeline, or in the MCU timeline, at the end of the movie if he created an alternate timeline? So the second option is that he didn't create an alternate timeline. Him going back was supposed to happen and therefore part of the sacred timeline, which is why we saw him at the end as an old man. If that's the case, then literally what in the world? Because that totally screws up all of Steve's character development, since we know what kind of person he is. He's very much I'm an action man, So I understand wanting to have a break. I understand wanting to retire, and that's fine. Awesome. Good for him. But Steve's the kind of person that he would do that for like maybe a month and then realize, oh my gosh, I will feel really bad and really guilty if I do not act. So besides the whole Sharon Carter thing and why didn't she recognize him and maybe Steve changed his name in that situation, did he just not act on anything throughout history? Like the Kennedy assassination, Hydra, all of the Hydra stuff. Like, he must have been involved in the formation of S.H.I.E.L.D., right? If he went back to Peggy and she helped form S.H.I.E.L.D. So was he involved? Did he just live under a rock so nobody recognized him or knew him? People would have had to recognize him at the time, right? He looks like Steve Rogers, who everybody knows who that looks like. Did he dye his hair? Like, what's with that? And then you get the whole thing about, like, what about Bucky? He knew that Bucky existed back then. Did he just not save Bucky? Really? He just let all of these things happen that he could have helped, he could have stopped? So both options, both the sacred timeline option and the, I guess this was sacred timeline option, this was the alternate reality option, both of those are really problematic. And I feel like it just wasn't thought through. So maybe if this was done before all of the Loki show stuff, still, it's a problem. In addition to the timeline issues there, while I think that he and Bucky talked through everything, and I think that in the Falcon and Winter Soldier show that was confirmed that Steve said, hey, Bucky, this is my decision, this is what I'm gonna do. And I super agree with him passing on the shield to Sam. I am all for that. But him leaving Bucky is just, like, not from a shipping perspective, I hope you understand, but from just a narrative standpoint, it doesn't make sense. Because all of the Captain America films were essentially about Steve either mourning Bucky, trying to find Bucky, rescuing Bucky, helping Bucky out, defending Bucky, like, all about Bucky. So number one, we have the I'm with you till the end of the line spiel, which is, like, you don't choose when the end of the line is. You don't say, oh, hey, I'm getting off here. Like, the end of the line is death, literally. So for him to leave and be like, yeah, sorry, bro, the end of the line's right here. Bye, Felicia. Like, no, that doesn't. No. Number two, Peggy was okay. She's a strong, independent woman. Of course she misses Steve. Of course she still loves him, all of that. But, like, she moved on. She did some really great things with her life. So, Peggy didn't need Steve as much as Bucky did. Bucky, like, we see in the TV show, like, he and Sam kind of work through some things, but Bucky's a whole mess, man. Like, he needs help, and he needs a better therapist. I don't understand with how the narrative string of all of the Captain America films is all about Steve trying to reunite with Bucky, how that can then end with Steve and Bucky finally have a stable relationship, they're finally okay, and then Steve's like, oh, I'm gone. I'm out. Bye. So, it just doesn't make sense to me. And honestly, I'm gonna bring it up again. This is another heteronormative situation where the value is placed on the relationship that generates having like a wife and kids over a platonic relationship. It's just like that is given more value. It's the better choice because, oh look, well he's got a family now. Whereas his relationship with Bucky really does have a lot of importance. It really is his strongest relationship, So it's just one of those things. So aside from some of those character issues, one of the other complaints I had was that I think that the Captain Marvel movie should have been released after Endgame and that the Black Widow movie should have been released before Endgame. And my reason for that is that throughout Endgame, we kept thinking, like, oh, Carol is gonna be, like, the savior of all, because we see her so powerful, almost overpowered in her movie. And then she does, like, just a handful of things in Endgame. I think that instead, if we had just been kind of teased about her presence, that it would have made her movie all the more exciting instead of her showing up in Endgame being almost a letdown. And then likewise for Black Widow, watching her movie, it's like, okay, well, she dies. Like, we all know throughout this entire movie that she is going to die, and so the whole family, all of that, it just makes it sad. And if they had put her movie before Endgame, we still would have been hyped up. Like, obviously the end credit scene would have had to be different, but we would have been like psyched, instead of just like, oh, this is kind of depressing. So speaking of the Black Widow film, I would first like to clarify that it wasn't a bad movie. I'm not trying to say that it was a bad movie. I watched it, I liked it, I enjoyed it, had a good time watching it. It wasn't the movie that I was looking for, and part of that I fault the film for, and part of that is just my personal opinions and expectations. Nothing the movie particularly did wrong in and of itself. Essentially, I was hoping to go in and see a movie that made me feel what I felt the first time we saw Natasha Romanoff and she took down Happy Hogan in that boxing ring. Her entire hallway sequence, which I spoke about in my previous video, in Iron Man 2, that was just like a work of art. Her scene in the first Avengers film when she's being interrogated and she's wearing that black dress and she is the one in control and she just takes down all of those dudes in that, I guess, barn that they were in the moment that we hear that Clint Barton is in danger. Like, that's what I was hoping for. Those were the feelings I was looking to recreate. And this isn't just about me trying to have a Natasha Romanoff who doesn't have any faults or something. Like, I'm a big fan of angst and tortured souls and working through trauma, all that jazz. But something about the way that Natasha was either played by Scarlett Johansson or written in the scripts, whatever you want to say, everything after Age of Ultron, it was a little bit better in Civil War, but in general after Age of Ultron, she just seemed really burnt out and fell kind of flat, which again might be an acting thing and not necessarily a character thing, but just didn't have the same emotion to it, Plus, one of my favorite things about Natasha is her hand-to-hand combat. So in general, I tend to prefer that type of fighting in movies than I do to like the big epic sequences, unless we're talking about, I don't know, Lord of the Rings. Those ones, the epic battles are everything. But for Natasha, like, this movie had it kind of did the, oh, remember this move and that move, like, these were the favorite moves. But it still had too much of the, like, big, dramatic superhero action sequences, which doesn't really say Natasha to me, and those scenes were great. They were fun. They weren't bad scenes. It wasn't the energy, the vibe, the tone that I was looking for or that I associate with her character. So some scenes that I liked, I liked the Dreykov interrogation scene where it calls back to some of her other scenes where she's like, oh no, I can't believe this is happening. But then it turns out that she's really the one doing the manipulating, and she comes out on top and like is totally in control of the entire situation. You're like, oh yeah, there we go, there's Natasha. Um, and then I also liked the Yelena apartment fight scene where she and Yelena just like totally go at it in that apartment, and are like using the curtains and everything in the kitchen and like smashing each other into the cabinets like that. I really liked that fight scene. It felt very real to me. So one complaint that I do have regarding the film itself is that I felt like the tone was inconsistent throughout the movie. So not just that it wasn't what I was looking for, but it was inconsistent. So the beginning with the little girls, brilliant acting, some brilliant scenes there. I felt like jumping through the screen in the theater and like saving those children. It made me very uncomfortable, but in a way that I think it was supposed to. It was supposed to invoke that sort of response. And then right after that, we have the entire opening credit sequence, which was brilliant, and it was dark, and it did a lot of the parallels to human trafficking and stuff. And I was ready for that film to like stab me in the heart after watching that, and then it didn't. Then it changed. The whole rest of the film felt different than those beginning scenes. In my opinion, Natasha should have been the one to kill Dreykov. I wanted it to be more of an anti-hero film, not like superhero, you know? I wanted it to be uncomfortable and dark and kind of bloody, but just real. So not like the violence that we see in James Gunn's Suicide Squad, because that's gratuitous violence. That's violence that is supposed to be funny, which I'm not a real fan of that type of violence, where it's just so ridiculous that you're supposed to laugh, because I don't think that's funny. But I wanted it to feel real. I wanted it to be serious, and I wanted it to remind me more of the movie Atomic Blonde, if you've seen that, where it feels so human. And that's one of the things about Natasha, that she's supposed to be human. She's amazing, but she's human. And it just seemed very apparent to me that this was supposed to be a family film. So if I were 12 years old, and this isn't saying that movies without violence are for younger people inherently, I'm just saying, like, thinking about the headspace that I was in as an adolescent and all of that, I were 12 years old watching this movie, it would be like my favorite film ever. I would be so into it. It would probably be my favorite MCU film, like perfect. But at this time in my life, wasn't actually what I was looking for. I wanted to see Natasha calling back to her Black Widow days, and I wanted her to have a certain level of rage and ruthlessness, and like maybe I need to do some introspection to see why I find films that are dark like that, with especially female leads that like beat the crap out of people, why I find that cathartic. It doesn't change the fact that I do. In general, I think that we need more female anti-heroes in these movies. So Yelena brought this up a little bit, where she was like, hey, you're not supposed to be a superhero, you're an assassin. And I feel like the way that the movie used that was like, oh, but she can be a superhero. When instead, I wish they had embraced that more. Been like, no, she's not a superhero. No, you should not aspire to be a Black Widow. You shouldn't aspire to like take on that level of trauma and horribleness in your life, you know? But that is who she is, and she has gone through that. So I wanted something like, I don't know, Batman the Dark Knight, Logan, Punisher, even Venom, you know, something in that realm where you kind of question the morals every so often, but you still get it. And in general, they're fighting for the side of good at the end of the day, but it's also very dark. So like when I saw the Logan film, I just remember being totally blown away by it, because even though at the end of the movie I was like emotionally drained and I can't watch that film repeatedly or something like that, it was still like just brilliant, and he was allowed to be unhinged in the way that Wolverine is supposed to be, and it made sense, and I was just hoping that we would get something like that for Natasha. Kind of in line with my complaints about the tone, I feel like there was too much humor in the film, and even though I laughed at the jokes, and I love Yelena, I think she's hilarious and fantastic, I don't know that that's what I wanted for this movie, and I think that they relied too much on sarcastic humor. Like, we could have had some jokes, but it was too much like Red Guardian being a buffoon, and them about to be serious about something and then not being serious about it. And that bothers me in movies when they do that, because I think there are certain situations where it makes sense to kind of joke about a serious situation. If it's a lot, that's all you can do. But I felt like this movie did it too much, where almost everything felt like it was turning into a joke, which is not my favorite. Going back to the Dreykov thing, this happens a lot in movies where it's like, here, let's take out all of the goons, and then when we get to the main really bad guy, who's the one we really need to take out, let's not kill him, because that's not the kind of person we are. And I get that, like, the scene was complicated and all of that jazz, and that he did eventually die. But what I was kind of hoping to see was that she would confront him and he would give her a whole spiel about, hey, you're not a killer anymore. You were a Black Widow, but you've moved past that, and you're not gonna kill me, and that whole deal. And then I kind of wanted her to, like, brutally take him off the board for everything he did to her and everything he did to all of those little girls. But they couldn't do something like that because this was a Disney film. So that's one of an overall complaint, is that everything done by Disney feels like Disney. And while that can be good if you want consistency and all of that, sometimes things aren't supposed to feel like a Disney movie. Like, a lot of the subject matter related to this film was not really Disney material. Like, the whole thing about comparing it to human trafficking and being an assassin and just all of that, that's not something that should be in a Disney movie, and I don't think that Disney particularly handled it well, because that's just, like, it shouldn't feel like Disney, and we're at a point where all of these MCU movies are feeling like Disney movies, and I don't know that that's always appropriate, and that I think for Black Widow, it should have been closer to how those Marvel Netflix series felt, where, yeah, they're Marvel characters, but they're grungier, they're darker, they're realer, they're like boots on the ground, kind of. So like I said, my relationship with this movie is very complicated, because it wasn't bad, but I just didn't love it, and that's kind of disappointing to me because I've been waiting for it for so long, and I totally recognize that has a big part to do with what I personally was looking for in the film, and they weren't supposed to cater to the audience of Renee, they were catering to the greater audience of everybody, and a lot of people really enjoyed it. So maybe I just had unrealistic expectations there, or too specific of expectations, but that's how I felt. So now let's put all of the things that I didn't like into the context of, well, what does make me happy? What did I like? Captain America the Winter Soldier is one of my favorite films of all time, and this is why. So, number one, this is a small thing, but it's shot in DC, a lot of it is anyway, so that immediately connected me to the film, where I'm like, hey, I know that place because that's like the closest major city to me. So it was really cool. It made me feel like Captain America was hanging out in my backyard or something. I also really liked I almost said Chris Evans, but Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff, I liked their relationship in the film, and I liked that it was a platonic relationship, and it was really strong, and I know a lot of people shipped them after this, but I got like a best friend vibe from it, and for a lot of the movie, they were the only people that each other could trust, and I just really enjoyed that aspect of it, and I think that's partially due to Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson being really good friends who have known each other for so long, so that chemistry was there, and I liked it a lot. I liked the addition of Sam in this movie from the start. He was really funny. Anthony Mackie is just a really funny guy, and a really great actor. So that was awesome, and the Falcon is really cool. I also enjoyed that while this movie is accessible to younger viewers, it also has a lot more going on if you're an adult or just somebody that understands or comprehends all of the different layers to the film. So they address a lot of real world sort of things like the government and the freedom versus security situation, you know, and I think they address it really well. And it was just kind of refreshing to get a different movie in that we're not dealing with superhumans or, I mean, other than Steve, but in general, we're not dealing with superhumans, we're not dealing with aliens or crazy villains, you know, what we're dealing with is essentially Steve against Hydra, but Steve against the government, and him having to kind of confront his inner turmoil and his morals and come into a world where technology has advanced so much from what he's used to, and like, what does that mean? And so then that goes back to us to ponder, what does that mean for us? How do we feel about that? Are we on Steve's side? You know, that sort of thing. And I feel like they captured that really well. Plus, Robert Redford's performance was just fantastic. Like, he took that movie up to a whole nother level. It was just such a great Steve Rogers film where, yeah, he pretty much has to deal with some type of moral dilemma in each of the movies, but in this one, he's very new into the world of superhero-ness, and he's trying to get back on his feet. He's trying to deal with his own personal baggage that he's got going on. He's dealing with the whole Bucky thing, which I'll get to later, but it highlighted his character, like his inner character as a person, and his courage and bravery and all of that, and so I really liked him in this movie. Another one of my favorite things of this film are the fight scenes. I adore this stunt team. They're so good. All of the fights are great. I especially like the boat scene, which is one of the first things we see in the movie, and it's just so well done. All of Natasha's fights are great. I feel like they captured the character of Natasha really well, where she's kind of sarcastic and all of that, but then you also see like the human side of her and her start to open up to Steve. But all of the fighting was fantastic. They had GSP as Batroc, amazing, you know, he's always great. And then all of the fights between Steve and Bucky were also like really cool because you have these two kind of super soldier guys, but they're still fighting like people. They're just like fighting to an extreme that most people don't fight at, which is a really cool effect. Speaking of Bucky, this movie is literally like Captain America. Bucky, you know? So Bucky's one of my favorite characters. Love him. But I do want to highlight like how much acting Sebastian Stan did with either his entire face covered or half of his face covered, or even if we could see his face, not talking, you know? And he managed to convey so much depth of emotion through his face. And I'm glad that people are starting to kind of recognize Sebastian Stan's talent now, because for a long time I felt like he was kind of underrated. He managed to convey the emotions of like a trapped animal, you know, who's lashing out and can't trust anybody and is terrified, but is also incredibly violent and dangerous, but is still the victim. So that's a really difficult thing to convey all of that together, but he showed that, and that's what we got. One of my all-time favorite things about the film, and probably one of the reasons it's a comfort film for me, is because of the Steve and Bucky relationship shown through it. Because Steve saves Bucky, but part of the way that he saves him is by like completely giving up. So after he's accomplished his mission and everything is falling out of the sky, you know, Bucky is just like beating him up, beating him to a pulp, and Steve just stops fighting. He drops the shield, he lies there on the ground, and literally would rather die than cause Bucky any more harm. And thankfully that works to kind of cut through Bucky's programming going on in his brain, and the whole "I'm with you till the end of the line" thing like snaps him out of it. But that's part of why Endgame just doesn't make sense to me. Steve has dropped the shield twice, and both times were for Bucky. So there was this time, and then there was the time in Civil War when Tony is like, you better choose either the shield or Bucky, you know, which was essentially like, choose me or choose what you believe in. And Steve was like, easy choice, and carries Bucky out. So, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it shows how much Bucky means to him. And so I guess what they were going for in Endgame was the whole thing about like, dying is easy, young man, but living is harder. So he's more than willing to die for his best friend, but when it comes to living his life, he makes different choices, I guess. Obviously, I don't agree, but I digress. There were just so many great scenes in this movie, and for a lot of movies, I'm like, oh man, I wish I could just rewatch my favorite scenes and skip through the rest of it when I rewatch films. But for this one, no, it's like great scene after great scene after great scene. It's brilliant. So there you have it. Those were my more in-depth opinions on my like 4 most emotional type of films, or films where I had the most emotions attached to them, I guess I would say. In the MCU, that is. So let me know how you felt in the comments. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for a book review coming really soon. I'm gonna I'm going to give a brief summary of all of the books I read this year, so if you're into that sort of thing, stay tuned for that, and I will see you next time. Bye!